Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. And I have to say, today's story is one of those rare ones where a single regulatory document quietly rewrites who gets to build the most valuable software layer on the planet.
That's a big claim to open with, so let's set the table properly for everybody listening. What exactly landed, who issued it, and why is the whole industry suddenly paying attention to Brussels again?
On July 16, 2026, the European Commission issued two sets of binding specification measures to Google under the Digital Markets Act. And these are not suggestions or guidance notes, they are legally enforceable instructions.
Binding is the word that jumps out at me there, because we have seen years of European Union announcements about big technology platforms that ended up as press releases with very little teeth behind them.
Right, and that history is exactly why this one is different in character. Specification decisions under the DMA are the Commission telling a gatekeeper precisely how to comply, not asking it to propose something and hoping for the best.
So walk me through the first decision, the one about Android. What is the actual technical situation today that the Commission decided was unacceptable and needed a mandated fix?
Today, if you have an Android phone, Google's own AI services like Gemini have full access to the deep functionality of the operating system, while competing AI assistants get a heavily restricted subset of that same surface.
And when you say deep functionality, I want listeners to picture something concrete, because system access is one of those phrases that sounds technical but doesn't actually land emotionally for most people.
Fair, so picture 4 layers. Invocation, meaning wake words and system-wide entry points. Context, meaning screen contents, sensor data, and on-device app data. Actions, meaning screen automation and cross-app control. And resources, meaning on-device models and background execution.
Okay, that fourth one is interesting because background execution is the difference between an assistant that answers when you open it and an assistant that is actually watching your day and acting on it.
Exactly. And that gap is the entire competitive moat. An assistant that cannot run in the background, cannot see your screen, and cannot act across apps is basically a chat window wearing a costume.
So the Commission's argument is that Google is not just winning the assistant race, Google is refereeing it while also fielding a team. Is that a fair characterization of the reasoning?
That is a very fair characterization. The Commission's stated aim is to ensure that competitors' AI services can compete with Google's own AI services by having equal access to features on Google Android devices.
And what does that actually look like for a European user standing in a kitchen holding a phone? Give me the lived experience version rather than the legal framework version.
You will be able to activate your preferred AI assistant by voice command, in the same way people currently say, "Hey Google," except the thing that wakes up might be a completely different company's model.
That is genuinely a bigger deal than it sounds, because the wake word is the most valuable real estate in consumer computing right now, and it has been effectively a single company's private property.
And beyond invocation, the Commission specifically names delegation. Third-party assistants will be able to perform actions and apps on your behalf, so you could delegate something like booking a taxi to an assistant that is not Gemini.
What else is in that list? Because delegation is the part where an assistant stops being a novelty and starts being infrastructure that people actually build habits around every single day.
The Commission also cites receiving suggested replies inside chat applications and asking your assistant questions about a place you recently visited, which means access to activity history and location context, not just text prompts.
Now let me push back a little because I can already hear the security argument forming, and honestly, it is not a stupid argument. That is a lot of very sensitive surface area to hand out.
It absolutely is, and I want to be precise about what that surface includes, because the analysis I have seen lists camera, microphone, location, screen content, notifications, contacts, messages, app launch data, and cross-app databases.
When you read that list out loud, it sounds less like an interoperability requirement and more like a permanent standing invitation into the most private device most people own. How does the Commission answer that?
The Commission says the measures incorporate robust safeguards to ensure that user privacy, device integrity, and security are protected, though the operative word there is safeguards, and the real test is implementation rather than intention.
Let's talk about the timeline, because a mandate with no clock is just a wish. And I understand there are actual dates attached to this one that companies are already planning around.
Google has to implement the core measures in the next major Android release, and by August of 2027 at the very latest, so this is not a distant theoretical obligation.
And there is a second date, right? Something about multiple assistants being able to listen for their wake words at the same time, which sounds like a much harder engineering problem.
There is. Concurrent hot word detection, which is what lets multiple services be triggered by voice simultaneously, is pushed out further and required by roughly August of 2028, reflecting how genuinely difficult that is to do safely.
All right, let's move to the second decision, because I think the search data one might actually be the more consequential of the two. And it is getting far less attention in the coverage.
I completely agree, and here is why. The second set of measures requires Google to share search data with third-party search engines, and crucially, it specifies that AI chatbots offering search functionality are eligible recipients.
Stop right there, because that clause is enormous. The Commission is saying that an AI chatbot counts as a search competitor for the purposes of data access, which is a definitional shift with huge downstream consequences.
It is a definitional shift, and it reflects the Commission finally acknowledging that the search market and the assistant market have merged into one market whether or not the legal categories caught up.
So what specifically does Google have to hand over, and how do we know this is not going to end up being a sanitized, useless trickle of aggregate statistics that helps nobody?
The decision states that, subject to anonymization, Google should share the same data that it collects to optimize its own search services, which is a much stronger standard than sharing some data.
The same data it uses itself. That phrasing is doing an incredible amount of work because it removes the obvious escape hatch of sharing a technically compliant but strategically worthless subset.
And the Commission explicitly framed it that way, saying the decision provides guidance on several key aspects which have made Google's data sharing offer ineffective so far, which is a fairly pointed admission of past failure.
When does this actually start? And is there any mechanism preventing Google from simply pricing access so high that no realistic competitor could ever afford to take advantage of it?
Data sharing begins in January of 2027, and the measures lay out a fair formula to calculate the price of the shared data along with a transparent process for accessing it.
The anonymization question is the one I keep coming back to because search queries are famously the most revealing dataset any company holds, far more revealing than what people post publicly.
The Commission set out a multi-layered anonymization method developed in close collaboration with internal and external privacy experts, aligned with the draft joint guidelines on how the DMA and GDPR interact.
Those joint guidelines involve the European Data Protection Board, right? Because that would suggest the privacy regulators were actually in the room rather than being handed a fait accompli afterward.
They were, and there is one more safety valve worth noting. The decision allows Google to assess, before sharing any data, whether sharing with a specific third party poses serious cybersecurity and data protection risks.
That is interesting because it hands Google a gatekeeping function inside a decision that was designed to remove Google's gatekeeping function. Do you see that being abused as a delay tactic?
I think it is a genuine risk, and the Commission clearly anticipated it because the decision says it may be amended depending on future market developments, including based on independent third-party evaluation.
Let's give Google the floor properly, because I do not want this to be a one-sided conversation. And their objection is more substantive than corporate reflex would suggest.
Kent Walker, Google's president of global affairs, said the decisions risk undermining vital privacy and security guardrails for millions of Europeans, and that Google had repeatedly offered solutions that satisfy the DMA's goals.
And the sharper part of that statement, if I recall correctly, was the accusation that the Commission discounted evidence. That is a fairly direct challenge to the regulator's factual process, not just its conclusion.
Correct. Google said the rulings discount extensive evidence of user harm, which is notable language because it sets up a potential appeal argument about whether the Commission properly weighed the record before it.
Has Google actually appealed, or are we in that awkward period where a company is publicly furious, but has not yet committed to a courtroom fight that it might lose?
As of late July, Google had not announced an appeal, and importantly, appealing would not automatically suspend the compliance obligations. So the engineering work has to proceed regardless of what the lawyers decide.
That last point is underappreciated. The clock runs during litigation, which means Google is now building the thing it is arguing against, and that changes the incentives considerably.
It does, and there is a fascinating third-party critique here too. The R Street Institute argues the DMA's interoperability mandate collides directly with Europe's own Cyber Resilience Act.
Explain that collision, because on the surface, it sounds like the same institution writing two rules that point in opposite directions, which would be a genuinely serious governance problem.
That is essentially the argument. The Cyber Resilience Act requires these same companies to minimize their attack surfaces, ship secure by default products, and bear liability for security across a product's entire lifecycle.
And the DMA is simultaneously requiring them to expand that attack surface by opening system-level access to third parties who do not write the operating system. That is a real tension.
The European Center for International Political Economy went further, warning the measures could open the operating system to what they called severe and unacceptable cybersecurity risks, which is not gentle language from a policy think tank.
So where do you actually land on this, given that both the competition argument and the security argument seem to have real substance behind them, rather than being purely strategic posturing?
I land on the side that says the concentration risk was already unacceptable. 60% of European Union users are on Android, and letting one company own the only privileged path to the assistant layer was never going to end well.
That is the strongest version of the case, I think. If the assistant becomes the primary interface to computing, then whoever controls its system privileges controls the entire market downstream of it.
And the security concerns, while legitimate, are also conveniently aligned with the incumbent's commercial interest, which does not make them wrong, but does mean they deserve scrutiny rather than automatic deference.
What should people who build products actually do with this information? Because a lot of our listeners are not regulators. They are shipping software and making roadmap decisions right now.
If you build an assistant or an agent, start designing for a world where Android system access is available to you in Europe by the second half of 2027, because that window is now legally scheduled.
And if you build a search product or an AI chatbot with search functionality, the January 2027 data sharing date is effectively a starting gun that most people have not heard yet.
Precisely. And I would add that the eligibility of chatbots for search data access may end up being the single most quoted sentence from this entire decision 3 years from now.
Last thought from me before we wrap. This is the first time I can remember a regulator legislating the interface layer of AI rather than the models themselves, and that feels like a meaningful shift.
It is a meaningful shift, and it suggests regulators have figured out that model capability is not where the durable power sits. Distribution is where the power sits, and distribution is what they just pried open.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.